Hello, I'm Joshua Kitts, the director of the Composed Dream Game Marketplace, and today I want to talk to you about FreeSpacer. In fact, I've been dying to do a video about FreeSpacer for months now. This book has been kicking around in my backpack. It's gotten slightly beat up, but it's held up amazingly well. So, let's get into what is inside this RPG if you decided to pick it up from the Composed Dream Game RPG Marketplace. Alright, so FreeSpacer is a Sandbox Starship RPG in the vein of Traveler and similar games. It's meant for medium to long-term campaign play. As part of that sandbox, there's a lot of you are creating the setting and so on for your game. It does use its own unique engine, which I'm tempted to call the Salvo engine. We'll touch more on that later on as we're looking at the book. Fundamentally, players roll all the dice. They roll d10s, and for their own their task dice for what they're contributing to and the GM will assign d6s as the level of threat or obstacle that's in place. We'll touch on more details later. So, this bills itself as a sandbox game, and what that means in this case is it gives you a wealth of resources to create your own galaxy, your sector, system, planets, as well as factions, which are very important to this game, and alien species. What flag your ship flies, such as courier, researcher, scout, or mercenary. There's also ones like technician, I believe, and a couple others. Those are going to affect the kind of stories you play a fair bit, as is the faction who has commissioned the starship that you are on. FreeSpacer provides workspace sheets for all of these things, so you can easily create factions and alien species and so on. There are examples throughout the book, and there are resources that you can get. If you get it from us, it's included in the download package, but you can also grab that from freespacer.com that you can print off and fill out all of these easy to fill out worksheets. All of these things, so like the skin type of your alien creatures and what they eat and so on, can be randomized. So they are all given percentile likelihood of occurring, including things as well like what kind of star is in the system that you're in and what kind of planets and what their orbit are and so on. All those things are things that you can roll for or randomize if you wish. In the book, there is at least one example of all of these things that we've discussed, but it is not an extensive catalog listing all of these. There is something else called the Sector Archives that does set up some sectors, usually with characters and so on, that you could pick up as well if you were interested in that more complete feeling and want to get into the action quickly. So, FreeSpacer clearly achieves the billing of being a sandbox game, but there's always a box with any sandbox. What are the fundamental assumptions of the setting or the fundamental assumptions that the mechanics allow you to work with? There are a few things. So first of all, setting-wise, it's 10 years after a galactic war. We're now in a period of sort of Cold War, where there's lots of conflict in the sector that you're in. The other three sectors of the galaxy are more established and tend to be ruled by one faction, I would say. But the sector your PCs are in, the interesting sector, is where this Cold War is going on. So this does give lots of things for your characters to do, lots of potential conflict as different factions jockey for power. FreeSpacers are commissioned by factions, and that includes their starship and their ability to be FreeSpacers. And they often find themselves involved in this Cold War struggle. So FreeSpacer's technology is very modular, both their personal gear and their ship. That means it's easy to upgrade them or modify them. There's resources in here that are complex materials that you'll require. You can augment yourself or your kit or your ship with complex materials. And it's easy to print new resources or use a technology project to create new assets for your ship and so on as well. FreeSpacers have all received agnathic treatments, meaning they can potentially live forever. And if they die, they can come back if their body is moderately intact from certain kinds of death by going through rebirth. That does mechanically, if you're rebirthed, change up your skills and so on, and alter your memories a little bit. Finally, FreeSpacers aren't part of society. Your personal goal as a FreeSpacer is to retire from being a FreeSpacer, to set aside enough money, to curry enough favors, and so on, so that you can retire into, ideally, an important position in society in one of the factions that you've been exposed to through play. Alright, so let's take a little bit more of a look at what is actually inside the book. How is it broken up? What does it look like? So, the hardcover is black and white on the interior completely. There's a good amount of space illustrations and photo type pictures. The PDF is in full color, and I believe the background is black and the text is mostly white. So just something to be aware of. There's a quick intro at the beginning of this, a welcome aboard section, which is a handful of pages, and then the first chapter is commissioning. And commissioning covers all sorts of commissioning. So the book assumes that you're going to sit down with your players and come up with the sector and some of the important quadrant factions, like the Society and so on, in the Orion Quadrant. Then it has ship commissioning, so which faction commissioned your ship is important, what flag your ship is flying, what your letter of marque says, and you're allowed to do is important as well. It covers those things. And then we get into crew commissioning. So you tend to start off with a little bit of niche protection because you will pick some stations. So each crew member picks 2 stations, and those might be things like Doctor would be a ship station. I'm just trying to find the list here of some example stations. A linguist is a station, a sensor analyst, a pilot is a station, gunner, mechanic, these are all stations. So that gives you a little bit of specialization. Skills are broken down a little bit on a chart like that. So you have 2 levels. You have 1 die in everything. You can be trained on it. That gives you an extra die. You can have expertise in it, which you do have if you had that station that corresponds to that particular skill. And then you have specialties, which would be up to 3 dice in that. When you're using a task, you could leverage gear. And if you are leveraging gear, you have to actually spend something called charge. You have a personal reactor, your ship has a reactor, you spend charge. This is a meta currency. It's also somewhat reflective of an actual piece of kit that you have on you, or your ship has, that is powering these devices. Now you can also spend charge on social contacts and so on, so it's not perfectly simulationist in that regard. it does also have kind of a narrative resource to it as well. So stations frame you a little bit and give you a little bit of a direction, but you then do have a lot of freedom to spend points to get essentially dice in different skills and specialties and so on. And you would upgrade your gear as well. Your stations would say, oh, you get an upgrade on this piece of gear and this piece of gear. So, for instance, the gunner would get an upgrade to their multi-tool, their shield, or their EVA suit. So your multi-tool is actually what you use to tractor beam things, as well as a energy weapon. So you could use it like a pulse weapon or a laser sword in melee. And everybody is also equipped with a personal shield as well. All free spacers are, I should say, many people you meet won't be free spacers and they won't have a personal shield. They might have something else. There's some stuff like you can touch on wartime history, and there's a quick overview of like, you can make new species here in this section. Most of that and details on what all of the skills mean and so on are actually in Chapter 4, Crew Life, where they go into fairly heavy detail. Throughout the book, there are handy references off to the side about, oh, you can go over to this page instead if you want to read more about this particular topic that's covered here. So there's a lot of that in the commissioning because it's really an overview of everything. Chapter 2 is the game mechanics, so it talks about your salvo and tasks and threats. There's certain resources, so we touched on charge. You can spend charge to use the benefits of your devices to your advantage, to actually use the extra dice or extra damage, those device upgrades that you have for your character. You'll need to spend a charge to actually bring those into the task. So fundamentally, you roll d10s for your PC's action, and you roll d6s for the threat. The GM will say how many d6s you roll. You subtract hits from threat dice on a 50-50, and on a 50% chance, and you add hits from task dice. So if a task dice which is a d10, is 5 to 9, you add a hit. If it's a 10, you add 2 hits. And then if you have 3 or 4 hits, that's a critical hit, and that actually increases your charge. So you can gain charge by succeeding well. There are a couple other ways to gain charge. I think if there's like double your threat dice, you get charge for trying some risky action. So that's the mechanics at a high level. There is a good video that Krzysztof Saspinski did, the designer of the game. If you want, I'll put a pin or a link down below to that if you want to see that dice with some examples, the mechanics with some examples. So you can help other people and they would be advantaged on something, so they would gain extra task dice. If you did something previously, that would assist them. And the GM can also add tags and things that say, okay, there's this going on, that'll increase it. Alright, so then we get into running the game, and this is actually mostly good GM guidance on how you're actually managing these mechanics. So there's some other stuff about setting scenes and so on, but then we have stuff about vignettes in terms of commerce, maintenance, and advancement. So how do you advance your ship, and how do you advance characters? How does trade play into that? So we have at least 3 important resources. There's complex materials. There's some other kind of material that I'm forgetting right now. complex materials generally gets used for upgrades and other very important things. This other type you could use to do things like make torpedoes for your ship. And then the final would be trade goods, so some sort of specialized thing that you can't really easily change into something else. I think it's raw materials. So useful raw materials, and then there's trade goods. So like a bicycle, a shipment of bicycles would be a trade good. It's already manufactured, and sort of has a value as a bicycle. 2/3 of this chapter or more focuses on encounters and projects. So he breaks it into discord, so when you're social conflicts or a social encounter. There's stuff about sci-tech encounters. There's conflicts, so when you're actually fighting, there's a section on that. And then there's a spice flight encounter. And this is when you'd be doing a single roll, or be taking single type actions and some guidance for those. There's also something for like longer term actions, which we call projects, where usually all of the crew members are contributing to something, and it might take an extended period of time. So there's negotiation. So when there's actually content in FreeSpacer about what contracts are you going to be taking, so and what exactly are the details. So a negotiation project is often about that. Salvage projects are about how much resources you can extract from something. This could include your foes, so if you just downed a shuttle and killed a few enemies, you might be able to extract some resources by salvaging it from their shuttle, potentially even some of the biotech from their personal augmentations. There's something on travel projects, investigation projects, fabrication, so things like making those torpedoes I mentioned would be a fabrication project, potentially. Construction, and then so the travel covers like a journey. You might be doing a travel project. Sorry, I'm jumping back there. And then the very important retirement project. So this is always a project that you're doing by yourself, and the idea is that you do a retirement project at the end of every contract, essentially. So that might be one session, that might be a few sessions. Once you have completed the job and returned to wherever, and you're considering taking on another job, you would actually take your retirement project. So that's a series of actions to see if you can curry favor with a faction, if you can essentially set aside resources so that you can retire well. So that's the running the game, chapter 3. Things are broken down. So this is, say, the conflict page. Things tend to be broken down a fair bit into tables with examples. Difficult, should the GM be making it? How many threat dice should there be or base threat dice should there be for a particular thing? You can add some sort of tag to the scene or something that would increase the difficulty a little bit, or circumstances could increase the difficulty a little bit. But a certain opponent might have, a 3 die difficulty for most things, for instance. Okay, chapter 4, crew life, is really all the details about skills and what they're used for, and your crew kit. So skills fundamentally are broken up into departments, which are sort of major sections, and there's five skills, maybe 6 in each, and then every skill has 3 specialties under that. I think the breakup here is quite well done. The specialties actually do help you understand what the skill is used for overall. And that's primarily, even if you don't have the specialty, you can use that skill for that, and maybe use an appropriate piece of gear for it as well. So the idea in FreeSpacer is that they talk about something called 0-point tech, which uses hyperdiamonds. You can then fabric of space-time. So the portable reactor, all FreeSpacers carry around with us is able to, in some manner, bend space-time and power things. So your ships themselves, or your ship, you would have a single ship as a free spacer. You would never be able to acquire a new ship. Your faction would always claim it if you would ever salvaged a completely intact ship. Mind you, that would benefit you in your progress towards retirement, having acquired such a valuable asset for your faction. So these reactors and so on are able to power all your other devices, and what all those devices are doing are covered fairly deeply here as well, and the different kinds of upgrades you could have for those devices. You can also have personal augmentations that would, much like a species might have a certain kind of augmentation. They might have a pressure shell or be able to breathe underwater or something. You could bioengineer yourself to have those same capacities. We cover the contingency type Corvette that you're in. So it's contingency because it's very flexible and modular. That is what we give free spacers. Everybody gives a free spacer ship. Very modular. You can alter it pretty easily. And you'd also have to allocate the space. So the numbers there are the amount of space units that would take it up on the map of your ship. You'd have a little map of your ship that you'd need to allocate all these spaces to. Is it in the aft? Is it at the rear, starboard, or port section? And so on. So the final section chapter is game prep. It is a substantial part of the book. This covers events, creating your sector, some extra context on species, some extra context on what does the Cold War mean, and then a lot of details on locations, so worlds, settlements, systems, different types of stars that might be in your system, and so on. And I'll touch on this because there are worksheets for each of these and mechanics for each of these. Other sophonts, so a alien is a sophont, so anything that can function like a human, they refer to as a sophont. Swarms, creatures, so there's worksheets for swarms, creatures, and behemoths. And then on the tech side, there are worksheets and rules for drones, shuttles, small craft, ships. This would include corvettes like yours, frigates, which are bigger, and then rules for capital ships. So one of the reasons you're given a corvette is because that is the easiest side for the fold inducers on your ship, or any ship, to be able to create a jump. So you fold away from a system at the edge of it, and you arrive closer to the center of gravity. So closer to the star you would arrive. I believe there is also some context here about jump gates, potentially for established areas. So I hope I've probably talked longer than I really planned. I did run a session of Free Spacer recently on Halloween. I might do a bit of a kind of after-action report on that, how that went, some things that I learned about the system as a second video. So, I hope this has piqued your interest in Free Spacer. If you want to pick this up from the Composed Dream Game RPG Marketplace, the hardcover, which includes a PDF copy, is $65. You can also buy the Sector Archives, which are $12. That's a supplement that has some different settings, sample characters, and so on. That is $12 Canadian. The PDF of the core rulebook on its own is $25, and if you want to get a bundle of just the PDFs, that is $37. All right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you'll join me for another RPG unboxing. I hope if you do have any questions or you think I erroneously covered something, please comment down below. I've seen some commentary online about Free Space are suggesting that it is a fairly bleak and dire setting. It can be played that way for sure. I think that's a dial that you can control quite a bit, actually. One of the big things here is I think it's nice that there is a goal that everybody is working towards: retirement. This is much like having in old AD&D and early Dungeons and Dragons, the idea that once you hit level 10, as a fighter, you get a stronghold. As a wizard, you get a wizard tower. As a thief, you can become the master of a guild. There's an endpoint. There's an objective that you're working towards, which is very nice. And potentially you could use a different game afterwards to play those characters in some fashion. Or they can retire and continue to inform your campaign in an ongoing fashion. Your GM could tie that old character in by asking the player who used to play them, what is this person doing? They're an important person in this faction now. What are they doing in the sector to influence politics and so on? This idea that there's all these factions that are kind of at odds. This just gives space for adventure. If things were too utopian, there would be no conflict, and there would be nothing for your players to do, or little for your players to do directly. So, I hope that has, as I said earlier, piqued your interest in Free Spacer, and if you've played it, would love to know what you think about the game, and hear about that below. Good gaming.